Welcome back to Proxima, everybody. And today we're going to be talking about the Craftworld Eldar Pheonix Lords. And we're going to be looking at their competitiveness in the Codex and as well as the competitive scene. So we're going to be thinking about which ones are worth taking, which ones are good, and kind of the different scenarios where you might find yourself wanting to take a Pheonix Lord of a certain type. So let's dive right into it. So again, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking a look at all 6 Pheonix Lords. So there are 6, although I wish we could kind of go over the Forge World one as well, but we're not going to go over that one today. We're going to leave the, I can't even remember what its name is, but the Shadow Spectre Pheonix Lord we're not going to talk about. We might talk about Forge World units in a different video, but we're going to skip that for now, and we're going to basically just assess them on their viability and competitiveness within the game. So we're going to look at their shared abilities first. So all Pheonix Lords benefit from this ability called Favorite of Cain. They all get a 4+ invul save. They can only lose a maximum of 3 wounds each phase. So what that means is if your opponent wants to shoot them more than that, they can't. Basically, it'd be a waste of shot. So they can't lose more than that. However, strangely enough, it doesn't prevent them from actually being targeted with attacks. So if your opponent already targets them with attacks, and then this goes over 3 wounds, all those extra shots will be wasted. So, for example, if your opponent tries to unload something like, a unit of Combi Meltas into them or something like that, big mistake, because it can only lose a maximum of 3 wounds in each phase. So it'd be a waste of shots. And also, sadly, the model can never have a relic or a Warlord trait or benefit from Craftworld traits. And of course, they all have Strands of Fate and Battle Focus as well. So let's look at our first guy, Azurman. So Azurman is basically your Forerunner Pheonix Lord, right? He's the first in the fluff, and he has a pretty average stat line for a Pheonix Lord. So standard movement for a Craftworld Eldar warrior as well. He is actually priced at 150, which is kind of in the middle of the Pheonix Lords. And if we look at his weapons, he has a fantastic ranged weapon because it has damage too. So it's not really much different from a twin Avenger Shuriken Catapult, except that it has damage 2 and 6 extra range on its range. So it's pretty good. It does have the Shuriken ability, which is nice. It gives it AP 4 on 6 of the wound. But again, you're probably not going to get that many of these. But it does give you some extra AP if you manage to roll high. Now, the melee weapon is really where this guy is at. You do want this guy in combat. Now, here's the thing. The melee weapon is excellent killing most infantry. +2 strength, -3 AP, and damage 3. This makes it a monster at killing things like Terminators and other tough targets. Has a good amount of AP and strength. Now, this is awesome, though, because of its special ability. Now, here's what its special ability does. When you roll a 6 to wound, basically what that does is it inflicts D3 mortal wounds on the target in addition to any normal damage. So this is especially cool when paired with Strands of Fate, because those mortal wounds can really add up. This guy has a lot of attacks. He has 6 attacks. Chances are you're going to hit 5 of them, and chances are you're probably going to get 1/6 naturally. So on top of the 6s to the 6 to Strand of Fate, you're going to be doing a lot of mortal wound damage. And this is going to get past all sorts of enemy invulnerable saves, armor saves, and their wounds characteristic, because to be honest with you, damage 3 is insane. So basically it happens kind of like this. Your enemy is going to take the mortal wounds before it takes any normal damage. So your mortal wounds can actually kill several models before they roll their invul saves or armor saves for the regular damage of the ability. So he's really a monster in combat against a lot of targets. I think if anything, his downfall is that he's kind of slow and can't really get out of trouble. But to compensate for this, he does have a 3+ invulnerable save and makes himself and Dire Avenger's objective secured. So if you stick him with some Dire Avengers, you can hold down an objective for a long time. And he also has the ability to benefit from his own aura himself. So he gives himself objective secured as well. And to the best of my understanding, pretty much all Pheonix Lords benefit from their own aura. But if I'm wrong on that, please let me know. And just, you know, because I'm under the assumption that, you know, in the rulebook it states that all Pheonix Lord, all models benefit from their own auras. They count it as in range of their own auras. So let me know if I'm wrong on that, though. I'd love to be corrected if I am wrong, so that I can correct myself. Now, the next Pheonix Lord is Baharroth, and he's pretty average as far as his stats, except for his movement. Because he has Swooping Hawk Wings, of course, he moves 14 inches, and he's one of the cheapest Pheonix Lords at 140 points. So this guy is actually one of the most competitive right now, and we'll go into why. But just based on his stat line, he wouldn't seem that spectacular, except for his movement is a little bit higher than normal. Now, if you look at his war gear as well, his war gear also doesn't really seem that impressive. Fury of the Tempest is essentially just a slightly upgraded version of a Hawk's Talon. It does have an additional damage, and an additional AP, and a strength. So it has +1 in each category, essentially. Has the same special roll that it auto wounds on 6s to hit. But this is just kind of a great weapon for harassing enemy infantry before going into combat, or just staying back and picking off a few infantry models here and there. It's really not a weapon that's designed to do a whole bunch of damage. Now, the melee weapon is pretty good at killing infantry. It's basically effectively strength 5 in combat with -3 AP, so decent, and damage 2. And each time you score a 6 to hit, it scores an additional hit. So it's really good at really focusing down mech infantry, like tactical marines, assault marines, kind of anything in that range. So models with 2 wounds that have a 3+ armor save, and really don't have much in the way of invul saves or that are very tough. So it's mostly going to be dealing with low to medium armor infantry that have 2 wounds, like Space Marines, and things like that. I think it loses effectiveness as you get cheaper. Obviously, Imperial Guards, stuff like that, aren't very efficient to kill, but if he goes after these kind of targets, he will be very successful. Now, here's the reason why he's so good. Because if you charged him in without this ability, he'd probably die in a couple turns, and he wouldn't do that much damage. His weapon isn't that spectacular, and neither of his weapons are actually out of this world as far as damage. But he has this ability called Cloudstrider, which essentially allows him to make a skyleap move, except he not only can use this instead of using his battle focus, but he can also use this instead of consolidating. So what this means is he can essentially charge into combat, do his damage, and then consolidate out by using this ability and move himself anywhere on the board. So when he's consolidating, he can actually just position himself anywhere on the board. So this is exactly what makes him so competitive. And I've honestly had trouble seeing any ability that's more quote-unquote Eldar than this. This is where it's at as far as, you know, competitive Eldar play right now. This guy can essentially come in, strike a target, suffer very little retaliation for it, and then move anywhere he wants on the board and do the same thing the next turn, turn after turn after turn, and he has objective secured. So he can literally go on any objective that he wants and capture that objective, as long as he's more than 9 inches away from enemy models. So he can come back on your own objectives, objectives that are uncaptured on the enemy side that don't have models within range. He can go to those. He is very flexible, and it makes him very, very hard to kill after shooting or fighting. So this guy's really frustrating for a lot of tournament players to fight against, because there's just no effective way of dealing with them. Weapons that ignore line of sight can't really do it, because he has a great armor save, invul save, and guess what? A lot of weapons are now affected by the indirect fire nerf, so he's getting an even better chance of saving against attacks. He has the Pheonix Lord rule, which basically says that he can't lose more than 3 wounds in a turn. He's just very effective at avoiding damage, playing the objectives, and harassing and annoying the hell out of the enemy. So basically, I mean, obviously, this guy is really competitive in tournament play. because of this ability. So a lot of players are, of course, playing Baharroth now. Now, I personally, it's funny because, you know, before Baharroth actually became so OP, people were selling them on eBay for like $5. So I picked up 2 of them just because I wanted to have something to paint. And now I have 2 Baharroth models sitting around. And now, of course, they're going for much higher prices on eBay because they're so competitive in the tournaments. And there's such a high demand for these models now, so it's kind of funny. But that's how Warhammer is sometimes. Sometimes a model is great one edition and then isn't so great the next. So I think, obviously, without Cloudstrider, Baharroth would be kind of not the greatest Pheonix Lord. He'd probably be considered one of the weakest. But because he has that ability, it actually makes him one of the most viable and competitive options in tournaments. And he does also have Sudden Assault, although I wouldn't use this ability because it denies him the chance to use Cloudstrider afterward unless he gets lucky and is able to get a charge in the turn he comes down. And because of, you know, reserves, if he comes in turn 2, you're actually wasting a lot of his potential. I would not have him deploy via Sudden Assault. He can do it if you need to, if you absolutely think that they have something on the board that can kill him turn 1. There's some sort of assassin waiting in the shadows or something like that. But, you know, honestly, chances are he's going to be able to get away from that anyway with minimal casualty. So I actually wouldn't use Sudden Assault with Baharroth. I would hide him normally on the battlefield. Now, Fuegan is the next Pheonix Lord, and he's a little bit different in his stat line because he has an extra strength and toughness at 5. He is also one of the more expensive Pheonix Lords at 160 points, and this kind of makes sense because he is a tank killer, and usually tank killing units have a little bit more points cost in general. But the problem with Fuegan really lies in his weapons and abilities. So let's take a look at his weapons. He has the weapon Seer Song, which is essentially just an upgraded Firepike. And if you look at the lance profile, it's actually only slightly better than a Firepike. It only has 1 more strength than a Firepike. So that's pretty negligible against a lot of tanks, for one, because you're probably going to be wounding on 3s in most cases anyway, even with regular fire dragons. And the beam profile actually leaves a lot to be desired. Basically, it has damage 4, it's strength 6, but it's overkill against most targets, like Terminators and regular Space Marines, and chances are it's not going to hit more than 1 unit anyway, so it's actually most of the time worse than the Lance profile, and you really shouldn't be going after infantry with this guy anyway. You should be going after things like monsters, creatures, vehicles, things like that. So unless they're running a vehicle parking lot, I just don't see this being viable. And vehicle parking lots, by the way, are going to lose every single game in this edition. If somebody brings an Imperial Guard armored company or something like that against you, and all they do is they park in a corner all game and stick together like glue, they're going to lose. It doesn't matter. They'll lose on objectives. So the beam profile, it seems like it could be good in some situations, but it's really just not. You're not going to get more than 2 units maximum. And because it only hits 1 model a unit, it's really not that impactful. Now, the other weapon he has in melee is the Fire Axe. So this benefits from his higher base strength. It has a good amount of AP, minus 4 AP, and good damage. So there's nothing to complain about it. However, Fuegan is supposed to be a ranged type character. He's a fire dragon, so that means he's supposed to be killing tanks at a range. And unfortunately, this weapon just isn't that great. It kind of gives him the impression that he's more of a melee character, and he is. And you'll see why in just a second. But basically what it is he is a ranged character who's actually better in close combat. He does have the Burning Lance aura, which gives him objective controlled, and it gives fire dragons objective secured. Now, this isn't going to be that useful on fire dragons because they're going to be going after enemy armor. They're not necessarily going to be playing the objective game, but it is kind of useful on him in some circumstances. He does have the ability Unquenchable Resolve as well, which essentially means that if he's lost any wounds in the battle, he adds 1 to his strength and attacks characteristics. The problem is the strength doesn't really add much against his preferred enemy types, which is infantry. It helps slightly against tanks, and the 1+ attack is nice to have, but to be honest, it's not really that good. So here's the other problem with Fuegan is that his assured destruction does not also benefit his melee attack. So he's a character that can actually do some good damage against vehicles in close combat, but he's only benefiting from the ranged attack option from assured destruction. So most Pheonix Lords have an upgraded version of their Exarch power. Or not Exarch power, sorry, the special rule that the unit has. Most of them have an upgraded version of it, right? So, unfortunately, Fuegan doesn't. He doesn't really have an upgraded version of this ability. So, he's only still able to reroll a wound roll of 1 against targets when he makes range attacks. So, unfortunately, they kind of missed the ball on this one, I feel, when they were writing the rules for him. Because, essentially, he's a character who doesn't really know what he wants to do. Does he want to hunt tanks? Not really, because he's actually less cost effective than a unit of fire dragons by themselves. So he's less effective at killing tanks than regular fire dragons, and he's also less effective in combat than a lot of the other Pheonix Lords, and to be honest with you, a lot of melee-centric aspect warriors as well. He doesn't really do that much damage comparatively. So, even though I really like this character, I think he's kind of not that great in a lot of ways. Yes, he does have a slightly higher toughness and strength, and he can perform decently in combat, but there are better Pheonix Lords for combat. For example, the next couple we go into, Janzar and Kahandras are both better in combat than he is. So, it doesn't really make much sense to take this guy, in my opinion, and you're better off not taking him unless you really like the character, or you have a specific strategy in mind for him. He just doesn't perform to the same level the other Phoenixes do. And to be quite honest, I think he's probably on the lower end of, in my mind, the lower end of them as far as competitiveness and effectiveness. So when we take a look at Janzar, she's kind of basic stat line again. She has a movement of 8, just like Howling Banshees, and she's kind of on the cheaper side at 140 points. Her weaponry is interesting. Now, her melee weapon looks really good, and I think this is until you really realize, though, that if you really look at it, if you look at the Sweeping Blow, a Howling Banshee Exarch with Piercing Strikes and Mirrorswords can put out comparable damage when she's charging against mech-style infantry. So I think the Sweeping Blow is easily overshadowed by her, little cousin, the Exarch. But the Piercing Strike version of this isn't too bad because she can reroll all failed wound rolls for it, so it makes it more effective against mech-style targets. Although, again, to be honest with you, I think her damage is really to the point where it's comparable to a Howling Banshee Exarch. And I think that when you're comparing an Exarch and a Pheonix Lord, the damage should never be comparable. So I think this was a bad oversight on GW's part. But if we look at the Silent Death, which is the Triskele, it's really good. 12 inches, assault 6, strength 6, AP 3, damage 1. It's really good at clearing out infantry before you charge in. So I think it's a very effective close range shooting attack. I was actually surprised that they made it that strong. But yeah, pretty good ability. Really a lot of attacks on it. And basically kind of makes up for the fact that her damage is very lackluster when compared to a regular Howling Banshee Exarch. And I mean, to be honest, she still does good damage. I'm not saying she doesn't do good damage, but when you add up the math, it's a little bit weird that the Howling Banshee Exarch is actually almost doing as much damage as she is. It's kind of a strange thing. So then she has the upgraded Banshee Mask, the Terror's Lament. And basically, this is the same thing as a Banshee Mask, except you subtract 1 from the attacks characteristics of models in that unit as well. So this is pretty interesting. This makes her a little bit more durable, and it also protects the unit that's charging in with her. Idealistically, you'd want Banshees charging in with her, but I think that'd probably be a little bit overkill in most cases. So the -1 attacks is probably going to have a pretty negligible effect because you're going to want to kill whatever target you're fighting and not give the chance, your opponent the chance to respond with their counterattacks. So in most cases, it's just not going to be useful. because Jane Czar and Howling Banshees probably should be killing the unit they charge into anyways first. So not really too effective in my mind. Now, on the other hand, the objective secured ability that she has as well is not really that useful on her, or Howling Banshees, because they're a very aggressive aspect warrior unit, and typically they're going to be charging after units the entire game. They may take an objective from an enemy and their objective secured will be useful, but in most scenarios, they're going to want to get off that objective immediately and charge after something else. So, I mean, to be honest, it's good. It's just not the most useful ability. I think objective secured is much better on things like Swooping Hawks and Dire Avengers and maybe Striking Scorpions than Howling Banshees in general, because they're kind of fragile and not really meant for holding down objectives at all. And lastly, just like her aspect warrior, she has the acrobatic ability, means that she can declare a charge when she advances. And also enemies that, level attacks against her need to subtract 1 from that attack's hit roll. And this basically just helps her get into combat and makes her much harder to kill at ranged and in melee. So overall, I think Jane Czar is a pretty good Pheonix Lord, but her damage is a little bit questionable when considering the fact that regular Howling Banshees almost outdamage her in combat, so for much lower points. So I would be careful using her, because unless you're strapped for elite slots or you have a specific plan in mind, she does get outcompeted by her own aspect warriors, and she doesn't do anything spectacular that her aspect warriors cannot do themselves. So honestly, I don't think she fulfills any unique roles that can't be basically solved by other units or, even Howling Banshees themselves. Now, when we look at Kahandras, the Striking Scorpion Pheonix Lord, we see that he's also on the cheaper end. He's at the same level as Jane Czar. Pretty basic stat line, and he's 140 points, so he's the same cost. So essentially, he's just kind of average. He's kind of like a Zerman as far as the stats go, but his weapons and special abilities are really where he shines. If you look at his melee weapons, he has 2 melee weapons. He basically has a Scorpion's Claw, which is Anra's Bane, and then he has a weapon called Ismathil, I think it's called. Yeah, Ismathil, something like that. But essentially, Anra's Bane is good at dealing with mech-style targets. He has Strength 8, minus 4 AP, damage 2 on these attacks. He's going to be wounding on 2s against most toughness 4 targets, and basically killing them automatically. Well, not automatically. Most Space Marines now will get a 6-up save against this because of Armor of Contempt, but still very low chances of them surviving the attacks. And he also has Anra's Bane, which the shooting attack version is just a regular Shuriken Catapult, except it has damage 2 and strength 5, so slightly better than a Shuriken Catapult. Now, Ismathil is an interesting second option to fight with, because this gives him basically double the attacks. So it's essentially Sweeping Blow. So instead of 6 attacks, he's going to be getting 12. This really benefits greatly from his Sustained Assault abilities and his Mortal Wounds from his Scorpion's Bite, which we'll go into in a second. But basically, this makes him better at dealing with invul save units, units with high numbers like hordes and stuff like that. It only has damage 1, but it increases his attacks basically by double. So then he has the Scorpion's Bite, which is an upgraded Manda Blaster, and basically essentially instead of 6 to wound, it's each 6 to wound deals 2 mortal wounds. So this is really effective when paired with Ismathil, which doubles his attacks. So you can get a lot of these by using Ismathil and maybe a Strands of Fate roll to make one of your wound rolls a 6. Basically, each one deals 2 mortal wounds. It might be worth it to do a Strands of Fate on this guy if you're going against a hard target, something that's, needs to die that turn. So pretty good ability, and I think it pairs extremely well with the Strands of Fate, and I'm actually glad they left it as an unmodified wound roll of 6 and not like a 5+ like it used to be, just because this way Strands of Fate can have much more of an impact. He also has advanced position, so he can deploy anywhere that is more than 9 inches away from enemy models when he deploys on the battlefield. And this is really great if you get the first turn in, because he can essentially charge outside of this. He can still do his normal movement and everything like that and charge in if you get the first turn. Now, the downside to this, the risk to this, is if your opponent gets the first turn, he can pretty easily be in a position to kill him. So it's a great ability, but you do have to be careful with it. And he also has Sustained Assault. So Sustained Assault gives him, just like his normal Striking Scorpion Aspect Warriors, this gives him unmodified 6 rolls of to hit, score an additional hit. Now, these additional attacks can't benefit from the Scorpion's bite, but they're still attacks, and they can still do a lot of damage on their own. So pretty useful ability as well to have. And lastly, of course, he gives objective secured to Striking Scorpions and himself because of his aura. And basically, this might be a little bit better on him because Striking Scorpions like to take out targets in the back lines, targets that are more vulnerable, maybe that are sitting on objectives and things like that. So it's probably a better use on them and Kahandras to target backline units because then they could just take the objective, and they like to, presumably, be in terrain while doing so, and because they have a higher armor save, they're going to be able to survive against enemy attacks better and hold down objectives much more effectively. Now, our last Pheonix Lord is Magan Ra, and he's interesting. He's been kind of a, well, he's actually just got a new model, but he's been interesting over the course of, the Eldar history. He's had times of very plenty, where he's been a really great character, and he's had times where he's not so great. So he comes in at 150 points, and if we look at his weapon option, he only has one weapon, but it has 2 versions. So it has a melee version, which gives him +2 strength, -2 AP, damage 2. This is a decent melee weapon, but it's nothing special. And honestly, it's only to be used in a last resort if he gets stuck into combat. So it's really not that great overall. Now, his ranged weapon is a good ranged weapon, but unfortunately, it's just not going to be able to deal with anything outside of mech targets. So the special ability also is kind of lackluster. It actually does not have the Shuriken ability, and this may shock a lot of you, but it doesn't have it, even though it's technically a Shuriken cannon. So each time an attack is made with this weapon, an unmodified wound roll of 6 scores 1 mortal wound on the target in addition to any normal damage. That's not that great. It's really not that powerful, especially since you're probably only going to get 1/6 to wound a turn. And most other Pheonix Lords, when they roll the 6 to wound, they do insane amounts of damage. A Zerman does D3 mortal wounds for each 6. Kahandras does 2 mortal wounds for each 6. And this guy only does single mortal wound. I know it's a ranged attack, and that's probably how they balanced it out. But it's just not that effective in general. And because it doesn't have the Shuriken ability, you're going to be hitting at a much lower AP in general, and models are going to get their armor saves. So Space Marines, if they're in light cover, are going to get their full armor save against this attack. And basically that's it. So it really doesn't do that much damage overall. And I think, unfortunately, GW, when they made this new model, they missed the mark on his rules, because this weapon is easily overshadowed by a lot of the other Pheonix Lords, as well as just, honestly, a basic squad of Dark Reapers. And I hate to say it, but he doesn't do anything that Dark Reapers can't do, and Dark Reapers are not considered one of the best units right now. In fact, they're considered among the lower tiers of Eldar units at the moment. So if he's being outshined by regular Dark Reapers, just think about what that means about his competitiveness and his viability in most games. So he also gives his Dark Reapers and himself objective secured. Now, this could be really useful if Dark Reapers were used more and were actually viable on the tabletop, because they could actually hold down objectives. So if they were a little bit tougher and they could hold down objectives more, yes, this would be a great ability for them, because they could sit on an objective and shoot from cover for the entire game. But because they're so fragile, it just doesn't really make much sense on them. And in most cases, he can just sit on objectives on his own in the back line with other units and still hold his own. because despite his shortcomings, he's still a pretty good character as far as him being a Pheonix Lord. He's pretty tough. So enemies are going to have a hard time moving him from terrain unless they're really, really serious about it and use a lot of anti-tank weaponry against him. And that's only when he's out of lookout sir range. And he also has the ability that Dark Reapers have, inescapable accuracy, which ignores dense cover when making range attacks. Not the best ability, to be honest, but on Manga Raw it might be okay because it'll make sure that he hits on a 2+ regardless of any cover, dense cover that the enemy has. However, it doesn't ignore other modifiers, and this was a big nerf that the Dark Reapers got in the current codex over their old rules, which essentially meant that they could only or always hit on a minimum of 3+. So unfortunately that's gone. Now they only ignore dense cover. And his last ability, Doom Incarnate, is really not that great. But it does do one thing. Essentially, this is what it does. It guarantees that if you kill 4 out of 5 models in a unit, that last model is going to fail its morale check pretty much no matter what and flee, unless your opponent ends up using a command point for it, which is probably in most cases not going to be worth it for him. Now, this is much less effective the bigger the unit is, because they probably would have failed morale anyway if you do that much damage to a big unit. But for smaller units, it can be effective at eliminating that last model in the unit. Essentially, if you kill 4 models in the unit, it's actually counted as 8 models. And almost nothing in the game, as far as infantry goes, mech infantry, has a higher leadership than 9. So, basically, your enemy is going to fail that morale test, and they are going to flee. So, let's say that you have a squad of 5 Space Marines, you kill 4, that last one is dead in the morale phase. So it's not a terrible ability, it's just not something that's that great. And overall, I think Manga Raw is probably ranking among the least of the Pheonix Lords, just because he doesn't really do that much more than what most other Pheonix Lords can do. And his own Dark Reapers outperform him much in the same way that Fire Dragons outperform Fuegan. So in conclusion, I think that when we look at the Pheonix Lords overall in general, there's a couple that stand out to be the most viable. Baharroth has by and far the most flexibility in competitive play. Being able to jump from objectives, being able to get out of trouble very easily, hit and run very easily, and just be generally very hard to kill and annoying. He takes the top spot, in my opinion, of competitiveness and viability. But he's not the only viable Pheonix Lord. Cahandras, there's a couple that stand out to be the most viable. Baharroth has by and far the most flexibility in competitive play. Being able to jump from objectives, being able to get out of trouble very easily, hit and run very easily, and just be generally very hard to kill and annoying. He takes the top spot, in my opinion, of competitiveness and viability. But he's not the only viable Pheonix Lord. Cahandras and Azuraman both deal a lot of damage in melee and are very powerful in their own right, especially when controlling objectives. And to be honest with you, dueling enemy characters. Cahandras is an absolute monster at slaughtering enemy characters. And to be honest, so is Azuraman, because they both deal mortal wounds. They both deal a lot of damage with their melee weapons, and they're very tough, both of them, combined. So, sorry, not combined, but, they're both very good at dealing with a lot of different targets you might be going against, especially tough targets. Now, the last 3 Pheonix Lords that I mentioned, Janzar, Fuegan, and Manga Raw, I think, suffer from really not doing anything different than what their regular aspect warriors can already do. Janzar is somewhat outcompeted point for point by a large margin by the Howling Banshee Exarch with Mirrorswords and Piercing Strikes. The Howling Banshee Exarch costs, about 30 points, I think, with Piercing Strikes, I believe, give or take. And Janzar is 140, so there's a big difference there. Obviously, Exarch is not as powerful as far as a character goes and can't survive as much damage, but can do comparable damage to Janzar in most situations. And Jane Czar also just doesn't offer much in terms of, extra combat ability that Howling Banshees can already do themselves. Fuegan is a character who wants to be a melee monster and also wants to be good at taking out tanks, but isn't really that great at either, and is outperformed in his tank hunting capacities by regular fire dragons, which a unit of 5 will only cost about 115 points. And will do much more damage against tanks, and honestly, they're not going to be good in melee, they're not going to be very tough, but are you really wanting to get fire dragons for their melee capacity? Are you really wanting to take Fuegan for his melee capacity? No, because there are honestly much better Pheonix Lords than Fuegan for killing tanks. Not killing tanks, for melee. And then Magun Ra, his problem is just that he just doesn't make much of an impact. You can put him on an objective, you can put him in cover, and he can be very hard to remove for your enemy. But the problem is, again, he just doesn't make much of an impact. His shooting weapon isn't that great. It's essentially just 2 shuriken cannons, an upgraded version of 2 shuriken cannons, but it doesn't have the shuriken ability. Instead, it deals mortal wounds on 6 of the wound, which in a lot of ways can be worse against certain targets. So, in honesty, Magun Ra is also not the best choice because he gets outperformed by Dark Reapers, his own Aspect Warriors. And think about it. He's 150 points. A squad of 5 Dark Reapers is 150 points. And a squad of 5 Dark Reapers will always pretty much do more damage than Magun Ra would do. So there's not really much of a reason to take him if the regular Aspect Warriors can do better. And take this into account as well. Dark Reapers are actually not in the best place right now, considering that they got nerfed pretty hard in this new edition, and they're pretty much overcosted for what they can do in terms of damage. So if you're comparing them to Dark Reapers, and Dark Reapers are better than him, and then on top of that, Dark Reapers are not that great, not that viable themselves, there's not much of a place for Magun Ra in most lists, in my opinion. Now, I could be completely wrong about some of these things, considering certain strategies that you guys may have, or certain different tricks that you've been able to discover throughout your games. I just know that when I play test these models, I typically play 2,000 point Strike Force games, and I can tell you I ran Magun Ra in only 1 game, so I don't have that much experience with him. But he basically just sat on an objective, and when I counted up the number of models he's destroyed over the course of the game, it really didn't add up to his points cost. And it's a sad thing, but he really just didn't make that much of an impact. So in general, unless you have something very strategic planned with them, I would leave them at home. And that goes same for Fuegan and Jane Czar as well. I think that there are better options for them as far as, their Aspect Warriors are concerned. Their Aspect Warriors outperform them in almost every way, point for point. And they don't really offer that much more outside of what their Aspect Warriors can already do. All right, everybody. That's it for today. But if you have any comments or you have different opinions on that, let me know. I'd love to hear you guys out and see what your ideas and tactics and kind of little tricks are. I've learned a lot from you guys as well, so please let me know in the comments. And also, just have a good one, everybody. I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. We have more videos coming up later this week. We're going to be doing a couple of tier lists for 9th edition units. Now that I've had several games under my belt to kind of justify it. So peace out, everyone. See you guys in the next video. Have a good one.